the window. But I just froze. I just froze. I know I've been had. And they took me downtown, and I believe it was the FBI, but they, at that time, they weren't like the mean cops like I just witnessed. They were professional, and they just wanted to make sure of who I was, and I guess they realized I was the runaway, and so they asked me questions, not maybe as harsh as they asked him, but they asked me questions about SDS. I didn't know what SDS meant. I'd run away, and that's where I was, and I was protesting against the war. So I think they kind of believed me, and so I was there in the juvenile detention center for a few days, and then they took me home, flew me home, and I went to see my mom and dad. I was happy for my mom and dad, because, I knew they were worried. I really didn't want to hurt them. I just wanted to travel and see the world. And I seen the world. I really got a chance to see the world. And I couldn't function after that. When I got back, I didn't know, the hate mail, the death threats. Oh. But there was some nice religious ones that kind of ease you over, and then you got the death threats, and then the news people in front of your house all the time. I was a real just basket case over it. I just wanted it at that time to go away. I was still 14, and I just wanted it to go away. But those mean guys dead. I just wanted to forget about it. And nobody's forgotten. They've always put it in the paper, and they just ask surface questions. They never really ask the real questions like they're asking now. All these years, 25 years, they've asked me questions, and they never really asked real questions. And they never really cared until today, about the people I can't. For whatever reason they were there, they never really cared. And those are good people out there. And I feel sorry for the people in Kent. They've had to deal with it. I thought, the parents, they've had to deal with it. And I felt guilty because I'm alive. And they were dead. And they were the students, and I was the bad girl. I was the runaway. And, that went in my mind, and I felt guilty about that. It just seemed like a whole big mess. Nothing ever, it just seemed like it was going in the pot all these years, and nothing's ever really been done about it or talked about it in an intelligent way, And I'm happy to be here today. I'm happy to be here with my husband and to get this all out. I'm an optimist, though. I still laugh real well, and I still, I'm trying to live a good life, and I just pray now that this good can come out of it. For whatever reason, we can't bring these people back. I know that. And I know now we'll get some truth out of it.
Thank you, Mary.
It happened. I'm that optimistic. optimistic, and I have that much faith in people that I know that you'll do it right. You'll do it right for the kids. You'll do it right for kids to come, okay? Thank you.
Well, I think we have been inspired, and we've also gotten a snapshot in terms of how this has affected two people who have been, I think, a part of our histories. And I'd like to thank both Mary and John for letting us prod into those inner areas and for being here today for that. So for both of you. I think we have a few people who are going to be assembling back in just a few minutes. But what I would like to do is we start this panel, which is going to be looking at the legacy of May 1970. What does it mean personally and nationally? We've added a few other people, some of whom have decided that they would like to talk about Kent State, and we'll just let those people, if we can find, sure, whatever. We have some people who've never spoken on the subject, even though they were eyewitnesses from Kent who have driven. We've had a caravan of truth coming from Kent all the way. How many hours, Alan, did it take you?
Kent drove, so I would say, what?
So Kent, from Kent, how long did it take you?
Kent from Kent, 12 hours.
12 hours. We also have a group of individuals in the audience who I'm very, very happy that they're going to be here and they'll be participating later. And that is Grant and Stephanie, who are doctoral students from Kent State University. They're going to be presenting their findings on what May 4th means to people today, correct? Yes. So the images, that will be tomorrow. What I would like to do, though, is if we could have, and I think he was here, Wayne Jacques. Wayne is here. Wayne has been involved in a very interesting project, and I think we have a historic first in Emerson. Wayne, could you explain to the group what you're doing?
Well,
And I think it's on display in the Helen Rose room.
right, a version actually of, we're setting up an online archive for the Emerson and, for Kent State and Jackson State incident material. And we've got a version of it that's over there in the other room right now that shows some of the materials that we've put on. It includes the conference schedule, what's going on at Kent State right now in terms of there's a conference there coming up next week. And a few other materials that Dr. Payne has gotten together. We're assembling this so that it's something that's permanent, and anybody who has materials from their own personal collections that they really want to get out to the world without having to go to a publishing company, this is the way to do it. It looks basically just like a book. You can have photos and nicely prepared pages. If you're not familiar with this, this is on the World Wide Web and using browser software to take a look at it. But if you look, there's a Macintosh in the other room, and you can see how we've started to do that.
What's exciting, as Wayne has said, I had done a book a couple of years ago, and the copyright had actually gone out on that. So Wayne has actually put that on the web, and it's available for people to read. We're also going to try to load Kent State Requiem, the video piece of that. I don't know how feasible or how quickly we're going to do that. But if any of you have materials you would like to load onto that so that we can have this as a Kent State source for people throughout the world who would like to inquire. The other piece that the other students has started, and Wayne has helped out, I think there are 3 or 4 people dealing with the internet, etc., was in just generating reactions to what occurred then in 1970 and how people have felt. And I guess I would say technology has changed, but people's attitudes seem to have stayed the same in some respects. We've had people who wonder why we're having the conference, who've said, I approved of the shooting 25 years ago. The only thing I would add to that is possibly adding a few people who plan conferences like that too. So if you're interested in looking and seeing what seems to be out there, or actually maybe getting involved with a good dialogue with Mr. Sexton from North Carolina, who signed his name proudly, what you could do is contact Wayne and we could go from there. Again, though, what I would like to do is welcome you to this panel, and I think rather than me introducing the panel members, what I would like for them to do is, starting with Alan, for them to give a description of their interest and why they are very, very intrigued by Kent State. And then if we could keep each of you to limit your comments, if at all possible, to about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we can have a good discussion and dialogue. And as I said, we are going to start the Evocative Communication Award, I have trouble pronouncing that, at 6:30 rather than at 7 due to some scheduling with John Filo. Again, thank you for being here. I'm going to try to wedge out of here so Alan can get started.
Good afternoon. My name is Alan Camphora. In 1970 at Kent State University, I was a junior. I was participating in the demonstration on May 4th very vigorously, vocally, actively. As John Filo mentioned a while ago, I was waving a black flag of protest, and he took a relatively famous photograph of me, which later was superseded by a Pulitzer Prize-winning photo. But still, I think a lot of people remember me as one of the people that was participating vigorously and vocally that day on May 4th at Kent State. Ultimately, I was one of the 9 students wounded when a bullet passed through my right wrist, entering through the front of my wrist and going through the side.
Before us. Looking back on when I was just a little nappy-headed boy, growing up in Mississippi, I had the pleasure of knowing Medgar Wiley Evers, who died there by an assassin's bullet in June of 1963. And in that summer of 1963, I was arrested twice for my participations in civil rights demonstrations there in Jackson, Mississippi. And then later on that summer, I had the occasion to attend the historic march on Washington, where Dr. Martin Luther King gave his memorable "I Have a Dream" speech. And I thought of Medgar that beautiful August day of 1963, when Martin Luther King approached the podium of the Lincoln Memorial and spoke these words: "I'm not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair." And we returned to Mississippi, filled with the hope that freedom would become a reality for those of us who were African Americans in that centennial year of the Emancipation Proclamation. But in the few days to follow, we were reminded that freedom was going to be a costly struggle. As we talk about the bombings in Oklahoma, I'm reminded of September the 15th, a Sunday, in 1963, in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. And 4 little black girls were killed that Sunday morning: Cynthia Wesley, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, and Carol Roberson. And when we think about Allison and Sandy and William and Alan's friend Jeffrey, my schoolmate Philip Gibbs and James Earl Green, I'm reminded of those words that Dr. King spoke at the funeral in September of 1963 in Birmingham. It is almost impossible to say anything that could console you at this difficult hour and remove the deep clouds of disappointment which are floating in your mental skies. But I hope that you will find a little consolation from the universality of this experience. Death comes to every individual. There is an amazing democracy about death. It is not aristocracy for some of the people, but a democracy for all of the people. Kings die and beggars die. Rich men die and poor men die. Old people die and young people die. Death comes to the innocent and it comes to the guilty. Death is the irreducible common denominator of all men. The next summer, I would testify about police brutality with Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer. And that testimony was placed in the congressional record. Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer went on to challenge the all-white Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and she changed the political course of history in Mississippi. And I was happy to hear Mr. Kraft say that his organization is involved in voter registration, because indeed it is a way that many of us see changes coming about positively. In 1968, I was a senior high school student at Linear High School in Jackson, Mississippi, when Dr. King met his tragic death. And later on that summer, I was arrested in the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. And then there was the college years, and in May of 1970, I was a sophomore student at Jackson State University. When campuses around this country were filled with choruses of protests calling for a change in U.S. foreign policy, and as Dean mentioned earlier, Dr. Martin Luther King, in an historic address at the Riverside Church, April 4th, 1967, 1 year before his death, broke his silence about the war in Vietnam. And 1 year later, April 8th, 1968, Dr. King met his death. And it was there on the campus of Jackson State, we too spoke out against the war of Vietnam, because someone else said there was blacks and poor people who were being disproportionately represented in that war. But not only were we talking about that war in Vietnam, we were talking about the historic racism in Mississippi. Some of you may recall that there were 3 civil rights workers killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964. Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerin, and James Chaney. James Chaney was black. And I don't think the nation would have paid any attention to what had happened in Mississippi had it not been for the fact that James Chaney was with Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerin. And similarly, I don't think Jackson State would be mentioned had it not happened so close to what happened here at Kent State University. And I'll close my remarks and entertain some questions about why I think that. But again, I want to thank Greg Payne and the May 4th Task Force for continuing to remember that there was also some students. Philip Lafayette Gibbs, a junior pre-law major from Ripley, Mississippi, and James Earl Green, when Mary talked about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. James Earl Green was a high school student taking a shortcut home that evening after his part-time job at a local convenience store. And he fell to police bullets that evening on the campus of Jackson State University. And having lived through that, having been there, having known Medgar Evers, having known Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, having known the families of the civil rights workers, for me, it was just another experience in the tragic history of our country. But I do think it's important that we have forums like this so that we can remember, and remember Santayana's refrain that those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
My name is Kent Kibler. I'm now one of your scheduled speakers, because if I would have been asked to be here, I probably would have squirmed out. I've never talked in front of anybody about anything about Kent State at all. May 1970, I was still first-year freshman. My background, I came from a blue-collar background. I'd worked for 5 years after high school in order to save up enough money to go to college. Even though I was programmed not to be a college student, I still wanted to chase a few dreams. When I arrived at Kent, I noticed some of the so-called radical students on the campus, and I didn't understand why they got the time or the energy or for wasting their money instead of doing what they should have been doing, studying and going to school. And as much as I didn't like the war and I didn't want to go to Vietnam, I just couldn't involve myself in what I thought was just frivolous behavior. The only thing that ever caught my attention was when I read in the university paper that they're going to napalm a dog on campus, to show the ill effects of napalm. So I me being a dog person, of course, I couldn't let that happen. And coming from that blue-collar area, I certainly would have to kick a little butt if I had to prevent something like this happening. And so off I went down to watch him napalm this dog, or attempt to. And so as I approached, the only familiar face I saw there was Glenn Frank, who was a geology professor at the university. I never had him, but he certainly caught my eye as I attended classes in this building. And first thing they said is we all walked up, and they had a good showing that day because there was a dog involved. They suggested that we all would come and stop them from napalming a dog, but we wouldn't stop our country from napalming all the Vietnamese. And I still thought it was rhetoric, and I just couldn't believe they wasted my time getting me there, but an afterthought, it was quite a statement that they made and did what it was necessary to get me there to get my attention. Maybe not at that moment, but in the following days, I realized what they were talking about. But I still had to get on with my life. I was gone the whole weekend that most of the activities came to be. Sunday night, I'd heard about everything that had gone on, and they said school starting Monday, so I had to be back there. So I arrived back in Kent Sunday night. I was probably a half a block from the main intersection of the front campus. I pulled in, parked in the driveway, and helicopters were overhead, tear gas floating through the air. I couldn't imagine. I hadn't come down the main street. I came in through the back way. I couldn't imagine what was going on. And I walked down, I just looked at it, shook my head, walked back to the room, and figured it was just one episode that night. Next morning I got up. I still hadn't had a clue what was to come yet, and off I go. I didn't even own a pair of jeans back in 1970. So I can see I'm still one of the last of the greasers. So off I go with my books in my arm and my little windbreaker and my nice pressed pants, and headed up there, and I look, and there's passenger carriers and jeeps and armed guards with bayonets and everything. And I couldn't believe it. I didn't have a real fondness for police over the years anyway, but this was more than I could understand at all. And, you know, you kept hearing the rumblings, there was going to be a demonstration, and the professors would say, you know, avoid it, don't go near it, they're going to stop it. And I did have a class in that area, but I think I would have gone anyway because that was my nature, just to find out what was going on. So as soon as they started ringing the bell, I was there. And it was shortly thereafter that the guard were there too. So, and not being a participant, I kind of moved up the hill, but I happened to choose the wrong location to go up. So by the time they started firing the tear gas, I was at the top of Taylor Hill. And as they proceeded to chase the students up the hill after a few minutes of back and forth, throwing tear gas and stones and yelling and swearing, and here they come. So I decided it was time to go to Taylor Hall. So I walked up to the door, walked in, but the door didn't open. There were people standing in front of the door, but nobody would let me in. So there I am, standing, trapped in front of Taylor Hall. Here comes the students that they were chasing, and here comes the National Guard, and they just walked right by me. They weren't concerned with us, you know, the innocent bystanders standing there at Taylor Hall or by Johnson Dormitory on the opposite side. So we just stood there as observers to it all and watched them march down into the practice field and chased Alan and the rest down into the parking lot and the field, and then just stopped. You know, I thought I heard a gunshot go off down there, but you weren't sure because nothing came of it. The next thing I know, here they come back again. So I'm standing there, and you can't go in the building, you can't go towards them, you can't go back down in the commons because there's more down there, so you just stood there. So I stationed myself about at the metal sculpture that ended up having the bullet hole to the 1-inch armor, this iron-plated metal there. As they're coming up the hill, the students were following them up, but it wasn't a rapid pursuit, and they weren't even close. I didn't think I was closer to them than the rest of them were. And as they're moving up the hill, there was just one person that stood out in my mind, and later on he was identified as Sergeant Myron Pryor. And he was the last one going up the hill, following his unit up there. And as he was going up, he kept swinging around. You could just feel the anger in his, you couldn't see his face, but you could just feel it in his movements. You know, somebody throw a rock, he'd bend down, pick it up, throw it back. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but you could tell he was calling them out. He wanted somebody to get close enough that he could hurt him. And just as he passed in front of me, horror just went over my body, and I couldn't imagine what was going to happen, you know, but things were getting too close for me. So I started backing up, climbed over the railing at Taylor Hall, and just as I got over the railing, I was still watching them. I saw them shoot, and they just all opened up. I started running. I ran behind the pillars in front of Taylor Hall, but by the time I got back there, it was all over. I looked out in front of me, and everyone was laying on the ground. I thought, oh my God, they shot everyone. I couldn't believe there were so many bodies on the ground there. And then everybody started getting up, and everybody saying, well, they're using blanks, they're using rubber bullets, you know, and kind of a sense of relief went over me there for a minute because, you know, we were just fooled. And then you look, and there were two people closest to me are laying there bleeding. And you just realized there were people shot here, and I couldn't believe it. You just stood there in horror. And by the time I worked myself up to go over and see who was shot, well, the one gentleman was standing next to me behind the sculpture. The other one was in front of the sculpture. There were people helping them. At that time, I saw Jeffrey Miller laying in the driveway. I didn't know any of these people. They were all unfamiliar with me. None of them seemed like radicals. The only familiar face that I remembered in afterthought was probably Alan Camfora's face. And I didn't think he was a big wheel at the time or anything. I thought he was more prominent after all this. So as far as radical people there, I didn't think any of them were radical. But as I walked down and stood there, you know, in fact, I was standing next to John Filo when he took the picture, but I didn't realize he was taking the picture. And you just knew there was nothing you could do for Jeffrey Miller. And you just stood there helpless. There was nothing to do. And then while we're standing there, you know, the guardsmen come up, and you're thinking they're helping them. They come back to help, and I didn't even know where they came from. They're just behind me here. They had come through on the other side of Taylor Hall. There was another unit who had come up there. And so I'm thinking they're helping him, and I look, and they're just kicking over his body with their foot and bayonet, looking for weapons, and lay him back down and walk away. And, you know, and all this horror is happening like within seconds, but it's just going on and on. And, you know, and you have all the hatred for them, and yet I still had some hatred for some of the protesters. When somebody picked up Alan's flag that he had dropped, or somebody's flag afterwards, and was wiping it in Jeffrey Miller's blood and swinging it across, splashing everybody. I thought, is everybody out of their minds? What's going on? They're shooting us, and they're flipping out and throwing blood at each other. I just couldn't believe it. At that time, I still didn't realize that more than 3 people had been shot. I didn't realize there was another parking lot and a half a hillside that was laying there bleeding to death. And what appeared to be, it felt like with hours, but it was only maybe 20 minutes before the ambulances came, and we helped carry off the bodies and everything. We just all stood there, not believing this happened. There were no leaders, there was nobody organizing anything, but just the anger that we all felt. We just simultaneously moved back over the hillside and started heading towards the guardsmen. And they had all, of course, aimed their weapons at us, and eventually had surrounded us on 3 sides, and Al Frank's father, Glenn Frank, who was the faculty marshal at the time, was begging and pleading for us to stop. You know, they're killing us, they're going to kill more of us, and, you know, and we didn't care. We just witnessed something. We realized that everything that happened in Chicago at the Democratic Convention, that was all lies, where we've been fed to believe that these people deserved getting their heads beat in, you know. And we knew that they were going to get away with it. When they shot everybody on that side of the hill, and there were no witnesses, all the television, all the TV reporters, all the radio people were all on the other side of the hill. And we knew, the only people that knew what was going on here was us. And nobody was going to believe us. They were going to get away with this. And so Glenn Frank begged and pleaded to the point of emotional collapse with people holding him up. You know, please stop this. Please leave before they kill you. And we didn't care. And it was just